What's up guys, Tim Little. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today's video we're talking about where do bass go in the spring, that pre-spawn to spawn transition, and the best baits to catch them. So we're going to cover all the different categories of fisheries, your Highland Lowland reservoirs, your river systems, your natural lakes, and then my 5 or 6 favorite baits to catch them through that transition. Let's go. Hopefully you guys have been following along the channel for a little while and you guys have seen kind of that early spring transition video we did. We did the winter to early spring. Now we're talking full-blown spring, that pre-spawn, spawn transition. Out here on the west coast, got warm. I think it's like 80 degrees today, so things are happening. Now, like we said in previous videos, depending on where you are in the country, your weather and moon phase kind of dictates where you are along these stages, these pre-spawn spawning stages. So if you're in the snow or ice right now, this video will be applicable to you later on in the year. But like out here, we're almost in spawn. So first off, springtime, the weather can be brutal. You know, it could be 80 degrees today and 45 degrees tomorrow, windy. So as you follow these fish through that transition process, as we teach you how to look for them, how to find them, you know, understand that weather can be brutal, but understand also that typically the weather does not reverse the stage that those fish are in. You know, they don't really back all the way out. They might back out a point or two or move a little bit, but typically they hunker down. So you can still catch them if you know where they're at, even during that cruddy spring weather. You know, if you're on a clear water fishery and you get a ton of rain, all of a sudden your tributaries, your backwaters blow out. Now you have muddy conditions. We're going to talk about that stuff later on in this video, but to understand that this is the best time. That pre-spawn transition is the best time to catch the biggest bass of your life. That is when the fish are feeding up. They're trying to move up into the shallows to their spawning bays, and they are more accessible to you and your lures and hooks. So now is the time to be out on the water chasing that new PB. So we talked about the weather because it can be brutal. We're going to talk about the different categories of fisheries. Now, like I said, hopefully you followed along. If not, previous videos, we'll link that video down below in the video description and right up here, talking about the different types of fisheries. Your lowland and highland reservoirs, your natural lakes, your river systems, you shore fishermen or you pond fishermen, all of this information will be applicable to your fishery. Just take what we talk about describing the different types of fisheries and figure out which your pond is most like. Is it mostly like a canyon lake or a highland reservoir, or is it more like a lowland reservoir? So real quickly, let me describe them for you. Like I said, we've done this in previous videos, but your highland and lowland reservoirs. Your highland reservoirs are your canyon lakes, steep and deep, typically clear water. Your dams are going to be very short, but very tall. So think of like Shasta or Hoover Dam, that type of stuff where you're actually damming up a river system. You're going to have big rivers in your fishery. You're going to have big long arms with lots of points, lots of secondary points. And your lowland reservoirs, that's going to be your flatter stuff. Sometimes those dams are going to be a mile long or a half a mile long. They're not very tall, but they're long because it takes a lot wider area to dam up that foothill type of terrain. So that's going to be your lowland reservoirs. Obviously your river systems, that's going to be your current systems, your TVA systems, your deltas, that sort of stuff. And then your natural lakes are typically lakes that don't have dams at all, don't have a ton of water movement, but can be fairly large, like Clear Lake in California, for instance. So those are the different types of fisheries. We've got a lot of boat traffic out here today. Beautiful weather, but hopefully the waves hitting the shoreline isn't too loud for you guys. We kind of tucked into this cove to get out of the way of the boat traffic. Got my buddy Wes here today, and we're doing some fishing, cranking, swim baits, glide baits, jerk baits, all that sort of stuff, all that pre-spawn stuff that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. So let's talk about river systems first, because that is probably one of the easiest, because the fish this time of the year in all the different types of fisheries, the fish are feeding up and they're going to spawn. That is what they do. Eat first, spawn second. So that is what they're trying to do. In a river system, everything is based on the current, and those fish don't want to use as much energy. So they want to get out of the current. You're going to be looking for your tributaries, your backwaters, any of your man-made marinas, anything that helps those fish get out of the current and get shallower. They're going to go to the very backs of those cuts where it's shallower, the water's warmed up, they're protected, and that's the spawning bays. That's where those fish are going. So if you're on a river system and there's a point that leads into the back of a spawning bay, that's where you're going to start. Start on that point, that, I guess, main lake point, and then work your way back to your secondary points and follow those fish. You know, hop between those points to find those fish in the back. They're going to be in one of those, 3 stages. So this is the time of the year to be throwing fishing fast, throwing reaction baits. Again, we'll get to the baits here shortly, but you'll be fishing fast, covering water to try and find where those fish are in that transition. So river systems, fairly simple. Now, one key with all of these, weather, like I said, plays a big thing with it. It's a big player with this transition and how fast and how quickly it happens. All of the different lakes, if you have a river system or a Highland Reservoir, whatever it is, but you have a big rain system and you have something that blows out with mud, typically that's warmer water, and those fish are gonna all the way to the back. So if you have lost your fish on those secondary points, had a rainstorm come in and kind of blew out those tributaries, head to that muddy water if you're comfortable with it, and those fish are going to be right up with their noses right up in that current, right up in that muddy water, because it's bringing them fresh nutrients, fresh things to eat. So that applies to all of these types of fisheries. So river systems, we talked about that. Work your way out of the current. Now let's talk about we'll talk about natural lakes, and then we'll go Highland and Lowland reservoirs. So natural lake, again, it's a lake typically without a dam. Even Clear Lake has a small little dam, but it's a massive flat lake. So think of like a giant pond. Not a lot of contours. They didn't have to use a dam, so it naturally filled up. So think of stuff with fairly shallow. For instance, Clear Lake on the north end, it's a giant pond that's like 8 miles across. The deepest part's like, there's some deeper areas, but for the most part, 20 to 25 feet. So it's all fishable. It's not going to be like your Highland reservoirs with those deep canyons and those long tapering points. So those natural lakes, those fish are going to use whatever structure they can to go from that 20 to 25 foot up to those spawning bays. So if you have a long Thule point, or you have a little creek channel, and the variance is very minute, it could be a foot or less. If you have an area that's a channel that's a foot or 2 deeper than the rest of that big area, that's going to be their highway. That's where they're going to use to navigate to get to that spawning bay. So if you know where they're going, if you know where that spawning bay is, find that depth change and work fish your way along that area, and somewhere in there you will find those fish. Now, if you find a key piece of structure, say a sunken boat or a bush or a small rock pile or something like that, that is going to hold fish. In those natural lakes, there's not a lot of cover, not a lot of structure for them to be around, to sit on or around. So when you find that, waypoint it and fish it, right? You catch fish, 4, 5, 6 days, and all of a sudden they're gone. Now they've moved off into that new spot. You have that waypoint. Go back and fish it, because new waves of fish are going to be using that highway to get back to that spawning base. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's natural lakes. Again, you're gonna find any type of structure you can, different little contour lines. On a Highland reservoir, those steep lakes, some of those contour lines are going to be, you could be 3 feet here and 90 feet there, right? So a natural lake, if you find those real minute, those little subtle changes, those are going to be key. So Highland reservoirs, Lowland reservoirs, I kind of talked about what they were. Now fish are going to transition completely different between the two. So figure out what type of fishery you have, Lowland or Highland, and let's talk about Highland, because Highland reservoirs, typically very tall dam, like I said, major rivers coming into them, long river arms, lots of main lake points, the points that separate the different river arms, but then all the way back, all those different points, those secondary points, those are like stepping stones. They're like, steps on a ladder. Their fish are going to use them this point, that point, that point, that point. So if you're on, you know, say the third secondary point to the back in one cut, and that's where all the fish are at, you've tried the fourth, you've tried the second, there's no fish, but they're all in the third, you can run that pattern on a completely different arm. They're gonna be in the same stage along that transition. So they're gonna use those secondary points, again, to try and get back to those big spawning bays. Now on a Highland Reservoir, that could be miles. It could be a mile or 2 or 5, and those fish are gonna make that move, and then they will summer all the way back there around that deep water and those bays. But you know, right now they're trying to eat, they're feeding up, and they're making that transition. So as a fisherman, fish those points along that progression, and once you find those fish, move with them. You know, if you, like I said, if you do have a storm come in, a real cold storm, you know, we've had some really freak storms around the country, things freezing and snow in places it shouldn't snow. That does affect the fishing, and it could make it better. So don't be hesitant to get out during those storms. But if it's a bad storm and those fish just shut down, they're not gonna backtrack out to the main lake. So they're gonna hunker down typically on that point that they were at. If not, backtrack 1 point or 2 points and you will find them. But again, it's just a progression through those points because you know where they're going to that spawning bay. And again, they're gonna pick the best structure on those points. So if there's, you know, 4 or 5 real barren points, but the next point is all chunk rock or, you know, nice gravel, pea gravel rock, has some standing timber, that sort of stuff, that's gonna be your point that you're gonna wanna fish, because that's where they all have to go in that arm. So Lowland Reservoirs, a little bit different. You're gonna have more rolling hills, island tops, you know, not nearly as abrupt, steep canyons. You're not gonna have the bluff walls per se, but those fish are gonna same thing. They're gonna kind of use the creek channels, and again, those are gonna be a little less abrupt than in the Highland Reservoirs, but they're gonna use the island tops. They're gonna use tree tops, that sort of stuff that's on that creek channel progression, and just like the Highland Reservoir. Hopefully this isn't too rough. We got the bunch of boats out here just going back and forth, but Lowland Reservoir, they're gonna use that same thing, those creek channels, to get their way to the back. You're not gonna have as many abrupt points, so it's not gonna be as obvious on Google Earth per se, but you can find where those spawning bays are gonna be, and then look at the nearest creek channel, look at the nearest island tops, and that's what you're gonna wanna fish. So now that we've talked about all the different types of fisheries, you know, pond fishermen, take that information and apply it towards your pond. If you have a real steep and deep pond with a real narrow but tall dam, same thing, you have a Highland pond. If you have a real shallow pond but it's a long dam, you got a lowland type of fishery. So those tips will help you depending on the type of fishery you have. So we've talked about the different types of fisheries. Now we're talking about the spawn, because that's what those fish want to do. They're going to the backs. Like I said, now is the time to fish fast, cover water, and track down those fish. You know, I'm talking about spinner baits, swim baits, jerk baits, square bills, glide baits, A-rigs. Now is your time to power fish, cover a lot of water, and find those big schools of fish, and you will find the giants. Those big fish have to move too. So I know I talked about it in the last video, that early spring transition. One thing I do want to say, depending on the type of fishery you're fishing, if you're catching a lot of smaller fish, so say like the buck males, so say you're fishing 4 points in on a Highland Reservoir and you're catching 12 inchers, pound and a halfers, fish that are typically small in your fishery, backtrack a point or two, because those big fish, the females, they're gonna move slower than the males. So if you're catching smaller fish than normal, try backtracking a little bit to find those bigger females. And that goes with all of the different types of fisheries. And you can really key in on those bigger fish. Again, I think I talked about it, but if you have that rainstorm that comes in and brings mud, those fish are gonna move quicker. If you have kind of a drier spring with not a lot of rain, kind of like the west coast this type of year, those fish are going to transition slower. They're going to spend more time making that transition. It's not going to be a straight bolt to the back, so you can stay on them easier and fish for them longer on the different steps along the way. So that is it, guys. I'm trying to simplify it. The biggest thing about this video is to get out and go fishing. This is the best time of year to catch numbers. It's the best time of year, your best opportunities to catch the biggest fish in your fishery and of your life. Again, power fish. You know, some of my favorite baits, a glide bait. You know, you can cover a lot of different points very quickly with a glide bait. And this has so much drawing power. You're gonna get so many more fish looking at this, or at least showing themselves, than say a 2.8 Kitech. A lot more drawing power. Even if the fish don't eat it, they're gonna show you where they're at, and that's the whole name of the game. We're this time of year, figuring out where those fish are at so you can stay on them with their progression. So a glide bait is my #1 bait that I like to throw this time of year. A close second is gonna be the A-rig. Again, covering lots of water, you can fish different depths and just move along those transitions. We talked about the Highland Reservoirs, you know, the different secondary points. Lowland Reservoirs, again, you're gonna use those creek channels. You're gonna look for those island tops and look for those kind of, I call them funnels or choke points or pinch points, where you have, you know, 2 high spots, but you have a saddle and it's kind of that creek channel. That's where those fish are gonna be. So fish very quickly with an A-rig or a glide bait, because those fish will show you where they're at, and if you need to, then you can slow down with your finesse stuff. But a glide bait and an A-rig is definitely a must. Now, I will say, I'm out here on the West Coast. Check your state's regulations on an Alabama rig. You know, out on the East Coast, a lot of states, Midwest, are 5 hooks. I know in California it's 3 hooks. I think Arizona it's 2 hooks. So definitely check your regulations before you go out and start chucking an A-rig. But glide bait, an A-rig, you know, if your fish are up shallow, go with a square bill. Especially, you know, Matt just did an awesome video on red baits. A red square bill is awesome. You can fish those real shallow transitions, especially in your lowland and your natural lakes. And if you're a little bit deeper, go with a 12 to 18 foot crankbait, because again, you're covering water, you're trying to find those schools. And last but not least, I talked about a little bit of a swim bait, and a jerk bait. Again, you're fishing different depths, you're moving along these transitions, you're not worming, you're not dragging a jig. Now you can, if you have a day that really slows down, then that's what you go to. But start off throwing the bigger stuff. You know, if you need, I mean, still our favorites, the S-Waver 168. If you want to get in the glide bait game, fairly inexpensive. You don't need special equipment to throw that. You know, when you start getting into the bigger baits, your 7, 8, 9, 10-inch baits, then you will need special equipment. But S-Waver or some kind of glide bait this time of year is hands down my favorite, because you are trying to locate those fish. Even if they don't eat it, they will show themselves and you will figure out where your fishery is along the way. So hopefully that helps you guys. Down below in the video description, I will link all my favorite baits, different colors, that sort of stuff. But if you get anything out of this video, it is to get out right now, go fishing. Springtime is the time to catch a ton of fish and the biggest fish of your life. If you guys have any questions, please leave those down below in the comment section. I will try to get to those as soon as possible. As always, guys, we appreciate you. If you learned something, give us a like, a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to our channel. We do 3 videos a week for you to help you guys catch more and bigger bass. Again, we appreciate you. Have a good one.